couple of weeks ago, I talked about the Leasehold Reform Act and the Renters Reform Act, and a few people have commented they'd like some more clarification on that and what is the difference. Because leasehold, renters, it all sounds the same. But in fact, they're very different bills and they were brought out for very different purposes. Leaseholds are things that generally you would buy when you're buying a flat. You would be granted a long lease, usually anywhere between 99 and 999 years of term. And it's a way that the UK allocates flats in a block of flats. Now, renters, when they're renting a property these days, they don't have a lease. This is a residential. They would have what's called an AST, a short hold tenancy, which doesn't give as many rights as a lease would. If you're renting a commercial premises like a shop or an office for a long period, you would generally get a lease, or if it was a short period, you'd get some sort of license. Now, the Leasehold Reform Act, as opposed to the Renters Reform Act, which I'll come on to, is about making things fairer for people who are buying flats and sometimes even houses which are granted leases. And this is particularly relevant to all the new bills that are going up everywhere, because the government felt that, and I agree, that a lot of these big builders have not been fair with people. In fact, they've literally been ripping them off. First of all, by giving them unfair leases. Secondly, high ground rent charges. A ground rent, what is a ground rent? It should be abolished, a ground rent. It's just a way of a freeholder or a landlord just getting income for life for basically doing nothing. And these ground rents used to be 25, 50, 100, but some of these builders were charging 200 a year ground rent, and instead of rising every 25 years, they were rising every 10 years, almost making the flats unsaleable. So hopefully that will go. The other thing was leasehold houses, which is an abomination, really. There should not be any leasehold houses. And leaseholds are fairly unique to the England and Wales. I think there might be one other country that has leaseholds, but most countries in the world would just give you a kind of a share of a freehold, which is a much fairer system. Obviously, you still need management in place, but a lot of these freeholders don't even manage the property anyway. They're just sitting on the freehold, and in 100 years' time, that property will go back to them and back to their family, or their children or grandchildren. And this is how families like the Duke of Westminster and some of the estates that are owned around central London have kept their fortunes intact for hundreds of years, in trust, of course, because these properties around Belgravia, you see these big white houses around Knightsbridge and Belgravia, most of those are owned, or the freehold of those houses are owned by the Duke of Westminster family, and the people living in them would be granted leases. And in fact, sometimes a lease in a place like Eaton Square, a 5-year lease could go for £500,000 or £1 million for a 5-year lease. It's crazy, it's ridiculous. But getting away from that, the government are trying to make it fairer for the average person buying a flat on maybe the government Help to Buy scheme, which they had. And a lot of people have got trapped into properties which have turned out to be a pretty bad buy. Bad leases. Maybe the other trick is to get the leaseholders in an estate of flats to take over the upkeep and the management of the surrounding areas, like the roads and the lights. Well, what are the councils for? That's the local authority's job, and it shouldn't be. The burden should not be placed on people who live in those roads to upkeep the roads and pay for street lighting and that sort of thing. I mean, what next? Are we going to have our own private security? The police won't go there. I just don't get it. So the government have looked at trying to make all these things fairer, but this bill has been sitting around for 4 years. They were arguing about it in the Lords the other day, saying that the bill doesn't go far enough, and that they want more rights for people, in particular, who are maybe sitting on a 40 or a 50-year lease and facing a very high charge to extend that lease, and it's often out of their control as well, because maybe that flat was bought in the 80s on a 100-year lease, and now it's got 40 years less than that, and it's not worth as much. In fact, mortgage lenders will usually not lend on shorter leases, so people have got a problem with those. and to extend that lease back up to a normal level would cost tens of thousands of pounds. So they're looking to make that fairer. But on the other hand, landlords and people who own these freeholders are sitting on equity, aren't they? They're sitting on wealth there. So can the government just say, well, we're wiping that out? Well, no. As far as I looked, the last time I looked, we were not a communist country, although we seem to be lurching towards that. But they can't just wipe out all that, especially for big influential landlords like the Duke of Westminster. I mean, the royal family, Prince Charles is a huge landlord. But there's the Cadogan estates, and there's huge estates around the West End of London, Marble Arch and Bloomsbury and these areas. And if you look on some of the plaques of the building, you'll see this is owned by blah 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 estates, and it's basically a family estate, but put into a limited company or a trust. So to take that, for the Duke of Westminster, who's worth maybe 10 billion, if you just wiped out the value of all these freeholds, you'd be taking billions from them. So I don't think that's going to happen unless we get an extremely left-wing Labour government in that decides, that they're just going to do that. But I don't think that's going to happen. And also a lot of MPs themselves own property and freeholds and that sort of thing. So as I said, it's a very unfair system. I mean, I was in a property meeting once, and there was a guy there advising people on converting properties into flats. And he said, you should not be granting a 125-year lease. And people go, why not? He said, always give a 99-year lease so that it comes back to them quicker, basically. It's a kind of a greed situation, really. And that's what the government is trying to sort out. Now, a lot of you might say, well, I bought a flat, it's on a share of a freehold. Yeah, you can buy flats on share of freeholds now. Say you've got a block of 3 flats in a house, or a few flats in a smaller development house, that they might say, well, here's a share of the freehold. That doesn't cover the management, though. You've still got to get together and manage the property, and it doesn't always solve all the problems. In fact, it can be problematic if not everyone in the block wants to manage it and wants to do anything. I've been in that situation myself. But leaseholds are a bit of a minefield, so just be careful with them. So the idea that leaseholds are going to be abolished and you'd have just a common hold, it doesn't look like it's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen. And basically, this government's only got until around November, when the next election is due to take place. So that bill could either get watered down or disappear into the long grass. So watch this space to see what happens with that bill. Now, the other bill that's been going through, and I've talked about this many, many times, is the Renters Reform Act, which landlords have been scared of, because the main thing that scared landlords was, well, apart from more tenants' rights, longer terms that maybe the landlord doesn't want to give on an AST, and the right to bring pets in, the main bugbear was the so-called abolition of Section 21 eviction notices. And a Section 21 gives the landlord to evict somebody without giving a reason, or without having to go to court to justify it, as you would do with, say, a Section 8. So they were going to abolish this and say, well, we'll still have a Section 8 in place. But a lot of landlords argued, well, the courts can't even cope with the limited amount of Section 8 evictions now. They're 6 to 12 months behind in some areas. How are they going to cope when every eviction would involve effectively a Section 8? So the government kind of backpedaled on it a bit. And again, this bill could end up dying a death, or it could end up being watered down and getting kicked into the long grass. I don't know. But they haven't got much time to sort it out. And then MPs are always on holiday. We've got the summer recess probably coming up soon. Then they don't come back till November. I mean, I don't know how this will get through. And so we'll have to see what happens with that. But something's going to happen, because if Labour come in, they will definitely take this bill up there, and it could be worse under a Labour government. Although, having said that, Keir Starmer is looking like Tony Blair Mark II. So, and they're trying to take the middle ground according to their manifesto, yeah. But when they get in, what will be the real situation? And I think, personally, what's happening is that they are keeping very quiet about the more loony left type of policies, and saying to all their MPs, just keep your mouth shut. Of course, Angela Rayner, you can't stop her yapping, but I think they're trying to calm everybody down, say, look, just keep quiet until we get into power. It's ours to lose, and then when they get into power, After a few years, then they start putting the boot in on for higher taxes and more red tape and legislation and all that sort of thing. Now, this is not a political podcast, by the way. I'm giving you the facts as I think they will be rolled out in the future. So the fact that the Renters Reform Act could disappear or not get through in time is not necessarily good news for landlords. And of course, we've seen up to 85,000 landlords quit the market because of all the red tape and that sort of thing. And you name it. I let a property for a landlord just recently. She had a rogue tenant put in by an agent who all he cared about was his commission. He put some tenants in who were not really suitable. They caused a lot of problems with neighbours. He also gave them a 2-year agreement with no break clause so that she couldn't get rid of them. And they did so much damage to the property that she spent thousands and thousands of pounds trying to sort it out. They broke everything, and yet when she went to get her deposit back, they disputed it, and it ended up with the tenant keeping 50% of the deposit. I mean, how can the tenant get the deposit? I mean, the deposit was there to deal with damages. They did more than the deposit amount in damages, and yet they gave half of it back to the tenant. And this is after like 5 or 6 months of wrangling. So it's not a great system for the landlords. They all seem to err in the favour of the tenant. But we've got a better tenant in there now, and hopefully everything will be okay. I think letting is still a good business. It's still viable. As more landlords have got out of the market, prices of rents have gone up. So I wouldn't abandon ship just yet, because again, what do you do with the money? If you sell a property, you're going to pay capital gains tax on it. So the government has its hand out for their share, of course. And then what do you do with the money? If you put it in the bank, it will lose value against inflation. Yeah, you can get 4 or 5% on fixed interests terms, fine. But you'll just get the interest. The capital won't grow unless the interest is rolled up, I guess. But it's not, to me, it's not as good an income source as property, and the capital values of properties tend to double every 10 years in most cities. So that's all for now. I just want to say one other thing about homelessness, that if things couldn't get any worse for the government and they couldn't come up with any worse policies, they've come up with this other idea to tackle homelessness and to clamp down and crack down on homelessness and people sleeping in shop door windows and shop doorways and that sort of thing, creating a nuisance. They want to fine them, listen to this, £2,500. What? Where are they going to find 2,500? They're homeless. Can you imagine them going to court and they say, okay, Mr. Smith, we're fining you 2,000. Can you give your name? Yeah, John Smith. And your address? Well, I've just been evicted from that doorway. I haven't got an address. I mean, how are they even going to impose a fine? Put you in prison? Yeah, that would be a home. I can live in prison, get 3 meals a day, medical treatment, food and bed and all that sort of stuff. It's just crazy. The other thing I don't think it's going to happen. It's part of an old act, but you can even be fined for smelling badly. What you might call instead of GBH, grievous bodily harm, it could be GBO, grievous bodily odour. I'm arresting you for grievous bodily odour. I mean, you just couldn't make this thing up. It's absolutely crazy. And apparently some of these rules go back to the Vagrancy Act, so perhaps the press has picked up on a few points. But the real problem, the core of the problem here, is that successive governments, not just this government, but previous Labour governments, previous Conservative governments, have not built enough council houses since the 1970s. And I remember the 70s when they were building lots of council houses and flats in the 60s and 70s, and people were getting housed. Certainly most people rented, and you could get a council house. My parents did, and you could pick and choose sometimes. And then when they got sold, when Mrs. Thatcher brought out the rule of right to buy, and they started getting sold off, which is fine. It gave people a secure home. But then they didn't build. They didn't use the money to build more council houses. In fact, councils were reluctant to build. They said, well, if we build them, people will end up buying them. So what? They're still in a house. It's not your money. It's the public money to do what what the public needs with that money. But so they haven't built enough council houses. And in those days when they were building more council houses, the property market was not rocketing up because, you know, the demand wasn't so high. Now everyone has to buy or rent privately to live. So you've had this new market coming in of private landlords taking over from councils. And of course, there's the difference. Private landlords were never meant to replace councils. So if the government wants to solve the housing crisis, then start building some more bloody council houses and stop trying to clamp down on people that live on the streets. It's just, it's wrong at any level. It's wrong, and it's completely lunatic. It's one of these completely loony policies that are just giving the current government a bad name and putting them further and further down the polls. So that's my little rant today. Okay, thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you soon.